Uh, okay, we're recording it. There we go. We got that message now. Thank you. I think we should just go ahead and get started, if that's okay with the folks from CDPHE and the members of my subcommittee. Okay, I decided to skip the icebreaker because I just wanted us to really have like a working session on some of the recurring questions that I heard during the last meeting. So I just want to welcome everybody to our subcommittee meeting. As a reminder, it's on the agenda. Our objectives were to kind of look at the lack of data and data sharing between state agencies in terms of the potential environmental hazards, and then also, make some recommendations on how we can improve research and data collection efforts across these agencies and how it relates to the disproportionately impacted communities. And then the last ask was, which I had hoped that we would get to today, was start thinking about measurable goals. But depending on how excited we are or how engaged we are on some of these other topics, I'm not sure whether we will have the time to get to the measurable goals. We might just put that, forward to the next meeting. So that is just like a quick recap of the agenda. Just talk a little bit about some of the recurring questions that came up during our last advisory task force call. And then we have a special guest today that will be talking about data from the Air Pollution Control Division. And then we'll go back again to talking about the recurring questions. I hope everybody's had a chance to look at them. Labna, I think, shared them at some point. And so unless there's anything else that you guys want to add to the agenda besides what's on it, just let me know at this time. I'm giving people time to get off mute if they're just talking into their microphone without knowing. Okay, well, all right. Okay, everybody, welcome to the call. And like I said, this meeting, I really want to roll up our sleeves because I feel we're getting closer and closer to drafting recommendations. I appreciate CDPHE taking an initial stab at drafting recommendations and us guys looking to see, we've done a lot of work. A big part of our task was to really start thinking about data sets, what data sets are out there. But then also recognizing that a lot of the data sets that I was looking at are potentially only quantitative data sets, like measurable data sets, air quality, water quality, things, noise and light, things that we can measure. But just like a real cursory look at the recurring questions, I get this sense that those are the data sets that were not clearly defined, that we need to start thinking about how do we start collecting that data, who can we turn to for that data, and where does that data sit? So that's my sense of the recurring questions. Does anybody want to weigh in what they saw when they looked at those recurring questions? If we looked at them, maybe.
Hello, loves. Thank you for welcoming to this subcommittee too. I have a couple things I kind of wanted to involve in this space, especially for disproportionately impacted communities, qualitative data. Suncor Sundown, being able to get oral traditions involved as forms of data can also be culturally and trauma sensitive to those communities that are going through harmful cumulative impacts. Also, if it's possible to start recognizing the intersex of data, whether it's air quality or land quality or just human quality of life in the space, to be able to start connecting them both in the biosphere and in the community in a way that I don't think state and federal agencies have really accomplished before with those types of contexts and subcontexts. Thank you again for including me. Sorry, it's all busy in the background.
No, welcome, Renee. I mean, I think that's what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking. I think during the task force call, we spent a lot of time talking about cumulative impacts. And I think our challenge here is, while not knowing what the subcommittee is thinking in terms, I mean, the subcommittee that's working the cumulative piece, what is it that they're looking for that we can help provide? And so I think our approach has basically been, let's just go as wide as possible and look to see all kinds of data sources, and then making sure it's available for whoever needs it in whatever format that they need it for. And so I wanted to take some time today to talk about that very point that you raised first, capturing the oral traditions, or capturing the community's voice, and how do you incorporate that into a policy conversation, which has always been a challenge. And so I did pick maybe just 4 really high level points, but for me, these all kind of touch on issues that a community can provide input on. Like when you think about cumulative impacts, the community voices are the ones that can tell you, what they see and what they consider as their sources of indicators that are causing them to feel like, there's this whole cumulative issue going on. And then how do we capture that information in a way that can be utilized by whoever needs to use it, whether it's the community itself when it's engaged in engagement conversations, or whether it's researchers while they're doing research, or whether it's the state itself as they're trying to make these more policy or regulatory decisions. So I just want to open that conversation. I know I have 4 bullets under that, but it's not necessarily only those bullets. I picked those because, like I said earlier, those are areas where the community always has the strongest voice. Any opening thoughts?
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Renee.
I was just saying thank you, love. I appreciate that, because that's as close as we're honestly going to be able to get to some spaces with data, because cumulative impacts are ultimately barriers. So we're trying to diminish where there's barriers in data to start recognizing that's not only a measurable form of recognizing harms or cumulative impacts, but can start being involved with the types of narratives of supporting cultural and trauma issues that can intersect in other state and federal agencies too.
Any other thoughts? I mean, I would throw out, like, from a really technical perspective, one method that sometimes that can capture a community's input is a health impact assessment. So you could broaden it to be an environmental, social, health impact assessment, which then captures all this information and is used in a decision-making process. But I think there is a challenge with those assessments. Specifically, I know there was one that was conducted around an oil and gas facility or a regulation in Garfield County, which might be interesting, to have a conversation around that one, that ultimately the commissioners or the county commissioners or somebody didn't finalize that document because there was a lot of controversy around it. So these types of documents that include what I call like the squishy part of it, which is sometimes the most important part, sometimes don't make it through like the regulatory considerations. And so we have to think about the challenges, like why like a narrative could not be used to make, like a policy decision, or how do we incorporate a narrative into the making of a policy decision? So if anybody has any thoughts or any experiences out in the field on how this could work or how it has worked in the past, that can be also really helpful to this conversation. If you think of anybody who can come and speak to us on that topic, that would also be helpful.
I could think of community members and then possibly even council members, because in Commerce City, that would force basically, we've had narratives to where people go to city council meetings, they're telling people what's going on with certain health effects, but because of the actual process, city council doesn't invest in those projects, it doesn't invest in grants that would support those narratives of those that are testifying. Being able to maybe include that, to be able to say, this is now a form of data that not only does city council have to weigh, but it needs to be considered in their next grant making or their next project making process or things like that, that they're able to recognize that people are not just talking these narratives to just speak, but it's an actual form of community engagement and civil engagement that should be required to not just be listened to, but involved in some exclusive way in those projects when that's what the community is requesting as well. Did that kind of correlate?
Yes, it does. I mean, when you think about the whole life cycle of a project, from when it's proposed to when the permit is being renewed, or different places where the community can engage, I think CDPHE has actually done some work. Again, I apologize to use the oil and gas as an example. I do know that CDPHE has this whole community investigation or some kind of a hotline in place where folks can call in with their concerns, and the agency investigates it. And so I don't know if anybody from CDHE wants to speak to that program a little bit more to see if it's something that can be leveraged in that sense, where if a community experiences some kind of odor or experiences something, that they can call into this number and hopefully it triggers an investigation. My review is on this, that they, if I was to make recommendations on this, is my recommendation word, Lovna, I would love to see this process be a little bit more transparent, to kind of have the community completely understand what happens to, from the point when you make that phone call and somebody copies down the information, how does it ultimately lead to some kind of action? You know what I'm saying? So that we can understand the process a little bit more. I do know some of our organizations have this grievance mechanism that they share, that ultimately starts with somebody calling in on a grievance or some concern, and then it explains the entire process of this person collects information, this person collates it, and it goes into this department, that it's reviewed, and then a decision is made based on whatever criteria to do an investigation that then triggers either air monitoring, and then the air monitoring data is collected, and then some kind of action results from that process. And so that the community knows that when you call this number, that you will get some kind of action on the backside of it. So that's just, an idea that we could leverage a program that's already existing and just enhance it to kind of meet our objectives.
Yeah, I just wanted to point, thanks, Christy. I was just gonna see if you wanted to elaborate on the hotline a bit. And I know Kelsey was with us last time and kind of shared some summary slides from that hotline data with us, and I'll drop a link to that in the chat. But it's kind of like a PowerPoint that summarizes some information from the hotline, and you can find that in the data subcommittee folder, and I'll put that in now. But Christy, I'll turn it over to you, and then Beatriz.
Yeah, thanks, Luna, and Uni, thanks for pointing out that our oil and gas health information response program that we have. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the state toxicologist, Christy Richardson. Kelsey Barton normally attends these meetings, but she's not available today. But it seems convenient that I'm here. Our oil and gas health information response program, I think, has taken a lot of great strides in terms of trying to collect concerns from citizens living near oil and gas operations and respond to those current concerns. I think what we have learned along the way is that our program is focused on health, and oftentimes people's concerns aren't just related to health. They're related to things that are overseen from a regulatory perspective by the Air Pollution Control Division or and or the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So we're working right now to further integrate those other teams into our reporting hotline. But I think another challenge that we have is when we have concerns reported to us, we respond to all of those concerns. And I know that there's, Uni mentioned, more transparency in how we respond to those concerns. I think part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we are adequately protecting people's privacy. So we don't necessarily want to share with the public the names, the addresses of people who call us to report concerns. So we're trying to balance that out. And I think also the other gap that we often hear from people in this concern hotline is that our program is not regulatory. Sometimes it can lead to regulatory actions because we might trigger an investigation from Air Pollution Control Division or COGCC, and they might find a regulatory infraction. But the health information that we collect is not necessarily regulatory. But I do think that we're trying to integrate that information and provide more transparency. So I'm happy to hear recommendations from this team as well. Thanks.
Go ahead, Beatrice.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, my question was actually around what you mentioned in Garfield County, Uni. Is that around 1266? Is that right? The health and safety measures that passed in 2020, and the 2,000 feet that oil and gas needs to be away from buildings?
No, this was actually way back when I think everybody was trying to find their footing around what potential health impacts were. And so Garfield County was like pioneering this idea of using a health impact assessment to really understand what the potential impacts to a community as a whole, that would come from oil and gas development. And so they did a health impact assessment. And I think it got caught up in a little bit of a political scuffle. And so at the time, I think they just made a decision not to finalize the report. So I think you can find that report online, but that I'm just using that as an example. Health impact assessments have been used by regulatory agencies in different places. I can give examples of it being used in Massachusetts, conducted by the state while they were looking at the siting of a compressor station. And more recently, the EPA administrator requested an HIA, I think it was in Chicago, around I think it was oh gosh, I can't remember. I want to say like a recycling plant or something like that, to conduct this more. So it could also be technical because you're looking at air and things like that. But if you really do a health impact assessment, you need to talk to the community to kind of talk to them about their concerns and see if you can address their concerns through this process. And if you don't meet whatever, bars put out there, then, that will be the outcome of the health impact assessment. But unfortunately, sometimes the community feels really strongly against a certain facility. And so that's when health impact assessment sometimes, I guess it falls apart. You know what I mean? Because it's no longer a tool to make sure that there's this collaborative conversation going on between. It became a tool for no. It just became a tool for saying no. And I think that was a little bit of a challenge from a regulatory perspective, as well as a regulated community perspective. And so the tool can be used, but I think there are just certain places that I guess people need to be careful on how it's implemented. So I mean, I'm going back to Christy's conversation. I mean, I do recognize that what the health and response that you have. I was just kind of commenting that it could be leveraged, that we could have something similar set up in terms of environmental justice that goes beyond just identifying potential health effects or exposure, but also cover some of these other topics. And not necessarily, you can still protect people's privacy, but by outlining the process through which your comments go through or people's input goes through, I think can be really helpful. Because if I know I'm just calling and it ends up on some phone log somewhere, I don't feel like I'm being served. And so if the state could develop a more, a more transparent process. And that's why I used the grievance mechanism that IPECA puts out for the oil and gas industry. It really outlines like the entire process on where your complaint or your grievance goes. And so to make sure that it's addressed, or if it's a matter of like, we only had one complaint, and so that's our threshold. One is not enough. We need to have at least 10 complaints before we can act. So it's just giving out these like criteria or guidances around how you address complaints from a community and making that summary information available. I know you work closely with the folks in Pennsylvania, and I know they also have their own little mechanism, and they do share, or I have seen like their report at the end of the year, like we got X amount of calls and this is how we responded to this specific concern. And so we just want the data. That's what we just want, the data. That's where we are.
Yeah, and I get that, and I think part of our challenge is that our database wasn't set up to do that, but each person who calls us does get that information. So each individual person who calls us gets information about how we're responding to their concern, what we're doing, and what the level of response is from our agency. I think what I'm hearing from you, Uni, is that you would like that to be more transparent to the public as a whole, and I appreciate that. I don't want to waylay this conversation though. So if you want to have a targeted conversation about our oil and gas health information response program, I'm happy to do that. I just don't want to us to lose sight of the goal of this meeting.
Yes, no, I completely understand that. I mean, I was just now I appreciate that the work that your state has done and how we worked closely with you. I'm just trying to see if this can get to some of Renee's, some of the things that Renee was talking about in terms of people, as this is one way to have a community's voice heard. I don't know if Renee is still there. What do you think? Would this be a little bit helpful? Is she still there? I hope she's still there.
I'm still here. Sorry, loves. I couldn't get to my mute button. Honestly, I think it would, but it needs to influence regulatory processes, or else it's going to be just another no tool too. And is there any way that once that data is already taken, that communities don't have to continue to retestify and retestify? That in and of itself, not only are they going through the toxics, but it re-traumatizes them. And then to actually try to influence regulatory, if they even get there, it gets politicized.
Okay, we can think about how we can wrap that into like a recommendation. So how that data could then be, once the state has a process in place of collecting that data, what does that data really mean? I think that's your question. Or how can it be used to integrate it into some kind of policy decision? Any other thoughts on that?
Just real quick, I also just wanted to mention the public complaints process that our ombudsperson, our environmental justice ombudsperson, Marcus Howell, is setting up right now, and kind of just related to like a hotline type of platform. That is something that is in the works right now and will be up and running very soon. Yeah.
Thanks, Labna. I mean, I appreciate the work, but I think the thing is having the whole having the community understand or see how that phone call can move a needle. I think that's the place we need to get to. And I think I've heard that loud and clear. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? So I think the other thing that we need to talk about is community-based participatory research. And this is another way that communities can influence, I don't want to use the word influence, but can participate in research programs that can help give them the data that they need to address some of their concerns. And typically there's a lot of challenges associated with community-based participatory research or community-based research. I know from a regulated perspective, as a regulated individual, is sometimes the data does not meet the quality that the state needs, or sometimes the data doesn't meet the quality that the system is required to make a regulatory decision. And so around that, we need to start thinking about what kind of recommendations we can formulate to help the state enhance that kind of research within a community. What are some of the ideas that we can think about, or experiences that we can draw on, where a community has engaged in a project that has ultimately led to a work product that can be then used in a policy decision? Does anybody have any experience having done anything like that? I do know, in terms of, you guys need to shut me up because I just keep talking, because I'm very passionate about this, as you probably figured out by now. I do know that communities, if you're doing some kind of like a semi-quantitative study, you can use those oral stories and the community input into it. But ultimately, I don't know if that's ever been used in a policy situation. I know it's been put into like research papers that can then be referenced during policy or during regulatory decision-making. But I don't know if there's like an absolute direct link between a community participating in a research project, which ultimately then leads to some kind of decision from a regulatory perspective.
MMIR is trying to do that by addressing missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And the data is coming directly from victim advocates and those that work with victim families and survivors. So that's been placed a lot, both across the continent, honestly, in Canada and the US. We could probably find some research in that space because it's so community-based as a crisis, so community-based as even a healing space as well too, that state and federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, have actually reached out in that space like that. And that's starting to influence state and federal just regulations, or at least addressing it with protections. I'm trying to think of other spaces. For Indigenous communities, it's hard because in the end, they're all recommendations because no treaty's ever been honored. So it's recognizing where different communities have already given only that form of data because that's all they had to give.
I think that's helpful. Can you share a little bit more, like a link or some information on that, so we can take a closer look at it, about that?
Yes, I have a bunch of stuff from Abigail EcoHawk, I believe.
Okay. So are we up? Is it Michael's turn here? He's here.
Yeah, Yuni, so Michael just joined us, and I think there's a lot more to talk about here on the community-based participatory research front. And I saw that Katie came on camera for a moment, and Beatrice, you look like you had something that you wanted to share as well. If you all could just like hold on to your thoughts maybe, and we can pivot real quick. And we do have Michael Ogletree here, who is the Division Director of the Air Pollution Control Division. And there is, this data transformation that's happening within the Air Pollution Control Division, to address a number of issues, including data gaps. And we thought that we could have Michael kind of come and just provide an overview to us and yeah, we would love to hear from you, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And nice to meet everyone. And thanks for being flexible. I was able to make this small window. So appreciate your flexibility. So as Lubna mentioned, I'm the director of the Air Pollution Control Division. I think it might be helpful to know a little bit about my background for you guys here and kind of introduce myself. So I've been at the division now just over 5 months. I started December 6th of 2021. Prior to that, I was the City and County of Denver, developing, among other programs, the Love My Air program, which is really focused on data communication to underserved communities, and in particular, public school communities across the Denver area. During my time there, I also on the side kind of developed, communication data platforms, as well as actual hardware for measuring air quality. So through my work at the City and County of Denver, have had the opportunity to kind of work on the technical back end of data platform development and data dissemination to communities, primarily through iterative focus groups with environmental justice communities in the Denver area. My mom's from El Salvador and my dad is Black. And so, having grown up in Southern California, I grew up on the east side of Southern California, kind of working and living in these communities, for me has impacted the way I've approached a lot of the outreach and engagement with the EJ communities, not only in my work at the City and County of Denver, but now here at the state of Colorado. So with that, when we're talking about data transformation, I think it's really important to involve community and co-develop these types of outreach and engagements and opportunities for providing input in a way that's understandable and makes sense to them. So as I mentioned, I did that some at the City and County of Denver. Here, we have an opportunity to do it at a much larger scale. Through the decision item that went through the legislature, we have about $5 million dedicated specifically to modernizing the data backend infrastructure of the Air Division. That comes in all different pieces, right? Right now, we still, in many cases, take in different requests via paper, which makes a huge issue for us, right? It's slow, it's prone to errors. And so kind of modernizing, for example, how we submit APENs or how we, receive permitting, having it available in a way that is easy to submit those allows for, faster processing of those things. In terms of the community and how community facing and particularly EJ communities receive information, that's something where we have, as I've begun at the division in December, kind of changed the way we do outreach, especially when we're not required to do it a certain way. And when I say that, I mean something like the Air Quality Control Commission, has an established method for taking in and addressing public comment. But when we have other opportunities to engage with EJ communities in less quote unquote formal settings, it allows us to have more of a dialogue and respond to questions and receive feedback and ask for more specifics so that we can use that information to better improve how we share and relay that information to communities. So it's really kind of this modernization is across the spectrum from all aspects of the Air Division. Right now, the other piece is none of it's cloud-based, so we don't have the ability. So we actually have physical servers. So it's a security concern, but also a processing concern, right? Because to add increased speed and access to these, we need to physically add more servers or physically add these different upgrades. Whereas if we move something to a cloud-based system like Amazon Web Services, it allows us to scale the data and access to that data in ways that would allow for growth as we increase the amount of data and information we have out there. There's just so many different, processes that are much higher resolution data than we currently have the ability to process and share. I can tell you that when I was at the City and County of Denver, for example, I was interested in getting minute data from the 5 sites within Denver. And the response I got was that they didn't have the bandwidth or capacity within the system to allow for that. So what we did instead, I set up an SFTP site where they pushed raw data and then we pulled that into our own system that was much faster. And that was minute level data for 5 sites. But now with the advent of low-cost sensors and the ability to collect data at much higher resolution, something that we do need, this modernization to be able to ingest and share that information at a wider scale. And things with our mobile lab, even further higher resolution data with many more parameters. So think about measuring 50 parameters with GPS coordinates in second resolution, so that's 60 times more data and much denser data as well with these multiple pollutants. So really, as we think through how we do this, it's not only just about the processes and interfaces, but how can we build a scalable platform for ingesting much higher resolution data and making sure that data is available to communities and researchers and everyone else who'd be interested in accessing that. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions about any and all of it.
Any questions from our subcommittee members in particular, Sheila or Beatriz, Uni or Renee?
Thank you, Michael. I have a question. In terms of overlapping that with climate as well, is not just pollution, but vulnerability to climate change or facilities that aren't just, I guess, polluting but are contributing to greenhouse gases. Does that speak the same language, or is it a different set of data?
So the way I've envisioned it, and this is a future vision and a future state, but what's going on right now is we have all these disparate data sets within the division, right? And so in the future, as we link all of these data sets, we'd be able to just in my mind, toggle a layer, and you can put a climate layer, you can put an EJ layer on top of the different measurements. So really, this modernization is not only about how we improve processes and collect and share information, but how the back end is structured so that we can have all these different layers talking to each other, and we can make some of these previously siloed data sets be able to talk to each other and tease out some of these things that you're getting at.
Thank you. And then the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately too, Uni and Michael, is economic cost as well to certain communities, because we're always sold this idea that the industry brings, jobs, or it's this narrative, but then also thinking about what is the long-term cost for the actual community and health, and also measuring when communities heavily invest in certain industries, long term. I think we've seen it across the United States, how over investing in a single industry like oil and gas or coal does that at the end of the day really benefit communities 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road? I feel sometimes those are in studies and academia and you'll see reports, but then you don't see it in the data that we're using to make decisions. If there's a way to overlap those, the economic projections as well, and then tie that to the health outcomes of community as well, and the burdens of health on communities.
So Joel, I've heard talk much more intelligently than me about this specific topic, but I think for us, there's two pieces, right? There's the economic impact analysis, and I'm assuming you're talking about some of the policies that we have. And if that is the case, all of the rules that go through the Air Quality Control Commission have an economic impact analysis associated with it. So as we're passing policy, we are looking through that lens. And then the second piece of that is I'm sure Joel can talk way better about that, but the health, sorry, Joel, there was that new thing that the health equity study, I think, that you guys are working on.
Yeah, Michael, so I think what you might be speaking about is some of the conversations that have come out of the task force's equity analysis subcommittee, so a different subcommittee than this one, about where Renee and Beatriz, as the co-chairs of this committee, you're obviously familiar with this, but the idea that I think we heard coming out of the last equity analysis subcommittee of doing some type of comprehensive or cumulative, regionally focused cumulative impact study that would consider sort of health impacts at a broad scale and cumulatively across media as a way of guiding decisions. So obviously, ultimately, that's kind of up to you, but it did seem like that was a direction. We heard you suggesting some ideas during the last equity analysis subcommittee. So we have informed Michael and some other staff about that, since it's particularly relevant to their work.
And have you all reached out to other entities who have done, I guess, this similar type work? I know Denver has a health equity index that kind of overlaps a lot of these different areas. So I don't know if you guys have had a chance to talk to or see what other entities have done in this space. And if you have it, it might be worth setting up a briefing from Denver, because I know that they did some of, like I said, this health equity index. And the person who actually spearheaded that, I guess, for Joel and Lubna was Michelle Shimamura, who is now at the state. So she may be able to point you in the right direction as to who at the city and county of Denver, might be leading that program now. But a good starting point is Michelle Shimamura.
Thanks, Michael. I think Lubna and I can definitely follow up on that and bring that back to the subcommittee or the equity analysis subcommittee. And as Lubna shared in the chat earlier, we have invited someone from the Chicago Department of Public Health to come to the next equity analysis subcommittee to discuss a health impact assessment that they recently conducted related to, I believe, a metal recycler facility in a low-income, predominantly Latinx community there. So I think we are kind of looking at all types of examples we can bring to the task force, but really appreciate that suggestion. We can absolutely follow up with Michelle. So. And sorry, I forgot to mute myself, but while I'm still unmuted, I would also just quickly add that Colorado EnviroScreen will provide a way to overlap indicators that do relate to climate change and environmental exposures like air quality or different types of air pollutants, as well as health outcomes. I think it has significant limitations compared to something like as comprehensive as the full data set of something like air pollution emission notifications or APENs that Michael was mentioning. There's sort of less granular data, but it is a source of information, Beatriz, to get at what you were talking about in terms of, can we look at the overlap of climate vulnerability and where there is air pollution? The answer is yes, that EnviroScreen will allow that type of analysis.
And I wouldn't sell short what you guys have built, Joel, because you guys have built it recently, whereas our back end was built like in the 90s. So I'm sure that the programming language that you guys use would easily be able to pull that layer into whatever we're building instead of having to reinvent the wheel. So in my mind, the future state would be linking all of these things together so that we can overlap many different data sources.
Okay, mine's just a quick question. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us today. Information very, very useful. I think one of the criticisms that I'm hearing around the air programs, I don't know if this is your department or who works on this, is just the number of monitors that are around the area. Some of them are designed to monitor for like really specific broader like PM 2.5, some of the NOx chemicals, and some of them monitor for total VOCs, which might not be really helpful in terms of, from a health perspective. Is there plans or opportunity to like install more monitors that are more community facing so that that information is more available? I do know some programs which may not be tied to CDPHE or the state are considering like fence line monitoring as another way to go in really capturing what a community is being exposed to in terms of air quality. It's like an interview question. You have to say a minute. Give me a minute here. Let me think of an answer here. No, I guess my question is, would you benefit from more air monitoring locations so that we can include that in as one of our recommendations?
You know, I think the first thing that I would say is of importance when we're looking at this is knowing what data is being collected, right? Right now, as you move from, let's say, Denver to Boulder, you have to look at 5 different sites to do that, right? You know, when I was at the city, I gave a presentation on the work we were doing there, and people were like, well, we didn't even know that data set existed, right? And I know even within the division, there's, you know, data sets that I'm familiar with that other folks aren't. So, you know, putting all the data into one place, I think is the first piece, because then you can find those areas in EJ communities that don't have any air monitoring, because right now, we don't even know who's doing what in what area. And if a community group is doing monitoring, we don't know about that. You know, and certainly if we have all of the data as much as possible in one place, then we can identify, you know, where there are shortcomings. So I think that's something for me is of importance. And as I've thought about how to do this, you know, like it was something I was doing in Denver. And when I was in Denver, I was like, well, the state should be leading this effort to aggregate all of the data from all of these different communities, because they have more resources than a city and county of Denver, and can help, you know, with communities who are starting to stand up these programs in EJ communities across the state, and not just in Denver, with some of the resources they would need to do it appropriately. Because there are a lot of challenges in air monitoring siting, as well as, you know, what you're looking to measure. And in my mind, creating a resource for community-led or, you know, local government-led efforts, I think is valuable, because I know the expertise, even sometimes at the local level, isn't there, because maybe they only have half an FTE. And don't have a dedicated air quality person, and maybe not even a technical air quality person to help, you know, those local communities with that. So I think that's a gap across our state, and you know, possibly more specifically in EJ communities. So, you know, I mean, I think that's kind of the first step in identifying which areas, you know, need what type of monitoring. Like I said, I've done a lot of this work in the city and county of Denver, so I'm super excited to be able to lead a lot of these efforts here as well. And for example, if when it comes to like regional data, if you guys have iPhones, you guys can kind of download the Love My Air app, which has started to aggregate some of those disparate data sets in one place. And that also is linked to a dashboard backend that's web accessible, that you can access more of the regional data from all of the different you know, entities that are doing air monitoring across, well, closer to the Denver area. But my vision is to expand that, so we know kind of what's going on across the entire state, and people have easy access to that information and data. Christy looks like she's like a grasshopper in a field. You look all small.
She's ready to pounce there.
Well, thanks, Michael. I was just going to add that I think it's really important to recognize that more information is really important, but getting the right kind of information is really important too. If we're trying to understand health risks, we need to understand people's exposure. And so, and we need to know what people are being exposed to. While they're super cheap and easy to install and then share data from, a purple air monitor might not be the right thing to put in your neighborhood if you're not concerned with particles, if you're concerned with, you know, like, let's say benzene or something in the air, right? So I think we really need to make sure that we're understanding what the exposures might be that could be causing health risks, and get information related to those. I think the other piece here too is that as we talk about all of the data that's coming into Air Pollution Control Division and other places, oftentimes that data is collected, in my opinion, for regulatory purposes. So they're trying to understand whether, you know, a facility is meeting its permitted emission rate or something like that. But And so oftentimes the data comes submitted to the division or to the department in a PDF that has nice tables and graphs of the data, but doesn't necessarily have the data. And if we don't get the data along with it, it really precludes our ability to use that data to answer other questions like, what might people be exposed to who live near this community? And I think a lot of the fence line monitoring that we're starting to see, especially at oil and gas operations, we now have Reg 7 that requires that fence line monitoring in oil and gas operations. It's really going to help add to that information that we have to understand people's exposure. And I think that's ultimately what's really important. So I guess I would say more data is important, but making sure that we get the right kind of data and that we get it in a format that is easily ingestible to answer questions about people exposure is ultimately what we need, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christy. I mean, I think that's very important, right? Even all the real-time data we have from Reg 7 doesn't have a standard format. So as we look to ingest it into a data platform for easier access, something in a more standardized format, I think would be very valuable. I don't know how much this group is familiar with how regulatory data is sent, but they have a very specific, it's called AQCSV, so air quality, comma separated values. And I'm thinking we could use something similar or a similar format that we can use for aggregating data. We could even use an AQCSV format and change some of the fields or add some fields to be able to do that. But having a standardized format and how data is collected and shared within the state would be, something valuable to, consider as a recommendation.
Yeah, thanks. I'm over here writing a lot of notes. I think what I'm hearing is I think first we have to understand what's already out there, and where it is and what it's collecting, and then from Christy, and then see if that kind of matches what's needed by her folks to understand potential for health effects. And so, well, we do need a lot of data. I think we need to be very systematic on how we structure our recommendation to make sure that all these different requests kind of fall within a process. I'm a process person. And so instead of just taking monitors and just sticking them all over the place, let's see what we have and see what we have, if it's collecting what we need. And if it's not, we identify those gaps and then determine how we start to fill those gaps. So it's a need for more monitors, or is it enhancing the monitors we already have and repurposing them, which is, no, I know from a technical perspective, doesn't make sense, but repurposing it to collect the information that you need, whether it's benzene, VOCs or something like that. And so that we're getting the data that we need to be able to make some kind of decisions. But then I think just in the main theme of the conversation about the community, I think this is another place where the community can step into this conversation, just as a part of trying to see where they feel they're being hit the most. So when we start thinking about the tiered approach, incorporate the community into it, because they know whose house or which location is probably being impacted the most. I'm just thinking about a way that you can engage the community in this kind of process as a part of this whole meaningful engagement piece of what environmental justice entails.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. So, for example, Joel shared that map for the regional dashboard, and that is some of it, right? But I can see a network that's missing from there, right? And that's the more publicly available Purple Air data network. I also know the work that Cultivando is doing, their data is not in here either. And so, like, I think it's an ongoing effort to be able to get all of the data, because a lot of people are starting to do some of this and pulling some of this information in. The second piece to that is, I think, involving the community and explaining to the community what can and can't be done with certain types of air monitoring data is also, very important, right? When we're talking about something like an exceedance of a national ambient air quality standard, you can't have an exceedance at, a Purple Air site, because it doesn't have all the QA/QC So kind of working with community and building collaboratively what this network looks like, so the community understands how we can and can't use certain data sets. And so we can kind of provide for them, you know, some context as they're looking to use these data sets for certain things, you know, how they should and shouldn't be using that. And, you know, Christy would and her team would certainly be part of those conversations when it comes into health impacts and how we as a community are using the data versus how we as a regulatory agency are using that data.
Yeah, I think it speaks to one of those questions, recurring questions about risk communication. You know, how is the agency talking about risk, or how are we talking about, I mean, how is everybody, I don't say we, how's everybody talking about risk and what it means? Because I do know some entities are putting, like, live streaming their data, I mean, the air quality data, which can be very, I don't want to say problematic, but, you know, it can be concerning in the terms that it cannot, sometimes if it's not interpreted correctly, it can mean, you know, something, you know, somebody may misunderstand what the data is saying, you know, to kind of get to what Christy was talking about, the way toxicology looks at exposures. There's all these other things that go into it just besides an air quality measurement. So a really good conversation. I really, really appreciate this. I think I've written a lot of notes, and I hope somebody else is writing notes, because my notes are terrible. Okay, good, because I rarely can read. Yeah, Morgan's, if I show you my notes, you can barely read what I write. I scratched on the page, but I think it makes me start really thinking about, you know, places where we can engage the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I mentioned, I mean, thanks for taking the time and working this into my schedule. I sincerely appreciate it, because it can be challenging, but I'm glad I was able to, you know, have this conversation with you guys. And, you know, as time goes on, you know, Lubna and Joel, feel free to reach out, or anyone here to reach out and have, you know, more detailed discussions. It's something that I think is very important to discuss data and how we as a community, you know, in EJ communities in particular, what makes the most sense and how to engage, so that we can draw a straight line from community input to, you know, actually how we kind of go forward with some of this data collection and dissemination to, you know, environmental justice communities.
Yeah, appreciate it, and make sure that that line actually leads to some kind of transformative change. And so we're just not putting out output saying, okay, now we have this data, now the data is available, but how can we use that data to actually transform a community? So I think that's also key. So Michael, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have you back, you know, once we've started ironing out our recommendations, and hopefully, you know, you can put your eyes on it and give us some further input. That would be really, really helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone.
Okay. So I think we need to take a short break. I've been sitting here drinking coffee, so I think we need to take a short break. So can we be back in about 5 minutes? Is that okay with everybody? Then Katie can kick us off with the thought that she's been holding this whole time, you know, when we get back. All right. Thank you, guys. We'll be back at 4. No, it's not 4. I don't know what time it is, but at like 6 after the hour.
Yini, are you back on? I just wanted to just check and see if you're there. We'll give it another minute or so.
I'm here. You know me losing tabs. That's always happens to me. I was like, it's not a team. I was looking in Teams. I thought this was a Teams meeting, and then it's like, no, it's Zoom. So finally hit the right icon. It's like never a dull moment. Sorry. I'm not sure if everybody's back. If is the committee back, Beatrice, Sheila? Just do a thumbs up or something. Just let me know if you're back so we can get back into this conversation. Dr. Davis has been very quiet today. Are you back, Beatrice? Okay, let's just go ahead and get started because I think she's back. There she is, yay. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's 10 after 4, and I want to continue the conversation that we had earlier, which Michael was very helpful with this information that gave us a lot more to think about. But before I get into all that, I want to give Katie a chance to talk about what her thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you. Met some, but not all of you, but I'm Katie Dickinson. I'm an assistant professor at the Colorado School of Public Health and have been following the task force's work, but I don't think I've come to this subcommittee meeting, so it's good to see all of you. So the comment that I put in the chat earlier was specifically around this question of, kind of community engaged or community generated data. And I have a lot of colleagues that do work in this CBPR world. I mean, I think just generally, in terms of, the recommendations for this committee, I think that, I fully agree that that needs to be a part of the data gathering landscape, that needs to come from community. And I also think trying to, as I mentioned, I think there are studies kind of documenting, side-by-side data collected by quote unquote, experts, scientists versus community scientists in different contexts, and showing that the data that community members collect can be and often is, just as reliable and valid as scientists collected data, and particularly because folks in the communities know a lot more about their communities. So I think trying to kind of break down the idea that that there's something inherently less valid about data that comes from community is important, and trying to document that where we can. And I had just a couple of other things that I was just going to drop here. I have to hop off at 2:30. So I just had two other questions as I was looking for through the recurring questions that you had. And so one is about data sources. So I don't know how much in the committee that's come up. So the community generated data is sort of one idea of that. But another thing in a lot of the work that my team has been doing around data justice is just looking at, information disclosure requirements, right? So oftentimes the kinds of information that we would need to understand exposures and to understand health effects, sometimes it just doesn't exist, but oftentimes it does. And, it's proprietary information that industry has, for example. And so, I think in again, thinking about the recommendations that this community is going to make, or this committee is going to make, how much of that, or where is the role for recommendations around sort of balancing, the prioritization of industry, privacy, and proprietary information versus community benefit and need for data. So revisiting some of that. I mean, one very small example from some of the work that we've done in North Denver is that, we were trying to find information about rail lines and what types of freight rail travels through the North Denver community, and found that that information is not accessible, that we can't find information about how many trains go through the community or what they're carrying, that is all proprietary information that the railroads do not have to disclose, and for their own privacy concerns, but of course, then where does that leave the community in terms of what they can access? And then I think that's just one example, right? Fracking fluids is another probably more well-known one. And finally, the thing that I would just drop in here too is, again, in this sort of data recommendations, I think the other piece to think about is where's the role for what are the criteria and the thresholds for decision making with data? Do we need to have a proven health effect at some level of statistical significance? Recommendations are, like thinking about things like employing a precautionary principle, right? So that's again, it's not just the data, it's not just the communication, it's also sort of rethinking where the decision thresholds are and how we, oftentimes kind of say, well, we don't have enough data about this, so we can't make a decision, as opposed to we don't have enough data about this, so we should be, making a decision that's more conservative or protective of potential health effects. So just another thing that I don't know if that's been discussed in this community, but was a thought that I had.
Thank you for joining us, Katie. I didn't realize you were with the Colorado State, Lisa McKenzie. Just what is her name? No. Yeah, with that group over there, I think you raised some really good things that you point at, and this may not be really relevant, but it made me start thinking about a conversation that one I heard from one of the stakeholders is we have a tendency to think in terms in long term, and these communities need help now. And so while the solutions to some of the questions that you raised in terms of proprietary information, privacy, those are always long-term, long-going conversations, trying to figure out, who's the best keeper of that data that won't share it, but has the access to the information that is needed. I mean, it's a conversation we've had in different states. Now I'm speaking as an industry representative here, but I think just recognizing that the communities need things right now is something that we don't want to lose sight for as we're making these recommendations. So just thinking about two different tranches of way we're looking at this, providing some recommendations for programs or initiatives that are more long-term, but also thinking about what we can do also in the short term to support some of the communities moving forward. And so I know it's not quite relevant, not really related to what you said, but it just triggered that thought for us, not to lose track of that. So Morgan, make sure you capture that so that we don't lose track of that. But thank you. That's really, really helpful, especially giving a good practical example of how you're running against access to data. And that was one area we hadn't even really considered, data from the rail, and just thinking about what those data sets look like and what they can and can't do. Maybe that's something, Labna, that we can have somebody from, one of the keepers of that data to come on and talk to us a little bit about their challenges with their data and how they're limited in what they can share on what goes through the rail. I know similarly, we have some similar issues with pipelines as well. So even trucking companies and things like that. So I'm not sure who you would talk to or who we would bring forward to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Katie, if you might have any suggestions there, considering like all the investigating that your students did. I feel like you would have probably the best sense of that here in this space.
Yeah, so that's what I was just putting in the chat, is that we are releasing this whole report. It's going to be online and in print, and there's lots of information there about where we looked for data and what we found and what we didn't. And we looked at multiple different sectors. Really, our focus was trying to say, like, what are all of the things that are happening in North Denver that are imposing environmental burdens and providing benefits to the larger region that are located in this area? What do we know about the environmental impacts of those, and what don't we know? Where are we running into these challenges? And so that's really detailed in there. We've got, EPA information sources and departments of commerce and various other things. So yeah, I'll make sure to share that with this team. And we are doing community launch and press release this weekend. So I'll share that information too.
So is it going to be possible, Katie, for you to come back and talk to us about your findings? Because I think, and not to use the term low-hanging fruit, but I think in what you found, there might be some issues that we can turn around pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to do that.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that, Katie, even like lessons learned from the student project that was being worked on for us regarding waste management in Commerce City. I think there could be some issues there.
Absolutely, yes. Another just like, I mean, that speaking of low-hanging fruit, yeah, my students did a project where they were going to be looking at sort of the flows of who's benefiting from the waste management services that are happening in North Denver. And so they had a very simple question, which is, where is all this trash coming from? Turns out really, really hard to get that information too. So, and again, because most of it is privatized, right? It's mostly private companies that are doing the waste management services, and to maintain their competitive edge with each other, they don't share information about how many trucks are going when and blah, blah, blah. And so we thought that would be, something that would be a relatively easy place for them to find this information. And in fact, it was not. So we'll share that as well.
Awesome. That sounds great. Yeah, maybe once we kind of have a more refined draft of these recommendations, Katie, you and I should coordinate and kind of think about how we can fit and your students into a future presentation. So that'd be great.
But the report will be available to the public. So can it be shared with this with this subcommittee? Labna.
Yeah, once Katie sends that along to me, I'll be sure to forward it on to the subcommittee for sure.
All right, thank you so much. I see Sheila has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm wondering about, and you might have investigated this, but proprietary information of coming out of Suncor. I mean, do we know what they refuse to put in the public domain? Do we have a sense of that?
That's a good question. If that question is for me, I think a lot of our investigation into Suncor had to do with looking at their EPA, documented EPA violations, and one of the things that we found within that sort of category is, as I'm sure many of you know, right, a lot of that information that we have comes from self-reporting. There's some monitoring and that EPA will do, but a lot of it does come from self-reported data. So that's another place where we're sort of relying on industry providing information. So yeah, I don't know. We could talk more about sort of specifically what they do have to report and what they don't in that realm. The other thing just to put out there, right, is that the newly passed air toxics bill is going to, expand what is regulated and certainly, information around those newly regulated air toxins will be important as well.
Joel, do you have more to add?
Yeah, I'm now wishing actually Michael was still here. But I think something that often gets missed in the public dialogue around air permitting is that the way that the Federal Clean Air Act sets up Title V air permitting really most of the substantive requirements, things like emissions reductions, aren't really established by the permit. They're established by statutes or regulations that are adopted by federal or state agencies. So we, as a regulatory agency, for the most part, in a Title V permit, we are just cataloging the requirements that are applicable to Suncor or another major source that's subject to Title V permitting. However, where we have more, I guess I would say, flexibility or opportunities to ensure that there are adequate protections in an air permit really does come in the form of that information reporting. So a lot of the changes that the Air Division made to Suncor's air permit for Plant 2, the one that went through the permitting process last year, really were to add a lot more robust record keeping, reporting, and to some extent monitoring requirements. So essentially ensuring that the data Suncor has about its own emissions is getting out to the public through us as a regulator, and also to us as a regulator in a way that's a lot more understandable to the community. Because oftentimes what happens is, a report will be filed in a drawer and you almost need a master's degree to really understand which web drawer to look in, let alone what everything on the form means. So, that was a really significant advance that happened through the division's review of Suncor's Plant 2 permit. Anyone who's following it closely will see that the Plant 1 and 3 permits, Suncor's other air permit that went out for public comment last week, has all of the same requirements in it. So that there is that sort of comprehensive across the board reporting on a more frequent basis of data in a way that's easier for the public to understand about what the emissions actually are. So that might not be the whole answer to your question, Sheila, and that is only on the air side, but it's what Michael and his team have really done recently to try to improve the flow of information coming about Suncor's emissions, at least in a way that's more understandable for the community.
Thanks. But is it your sense that, this is a rhetorical question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Is it your sense that they're hiding? They're hiding. There's information they're hiding.
I want to answer that carefully since we are in a public meeting, and I'm honestly not the right person to answer that question, right? I'm not the permit engineer. I know that, as with all of our relationships with regulated industry, often there can be an information gap that's really important for us to close as regulators. And I know it's been a really significant focus of not only our permitting team, but also our enforcement team to ensure that our recent enforcement actions have also included requirements to improve the flow of information from the facility. So I'll just say that and just say I'm not an expert in this, but certainly for you all, I guess I would just say in my hat as your staff, obviously, there are really different case-by-case examples of the types of information each of our divisions have access to about the industries we regulate, and that could certainly be a data gap that could be an area that you all make recommendations about. But I'm not going to pretend that I'm familiar enough with all the data from Suncor to understand if there's a specific challenge that you all should be thinking about there.
Well, I'm reading what JD put in the chat.
Do we want JD to talk about it a little bit, to explain what he's trying to say? JD, you have a couple of minutes to speak to the comment you made in the chat. So,
hey everyone, every time I hear these things, it's really frustrating because it always seems we need data and industry controls the data. And as we're doing this, the people are hurting. When you have an industry that actually controls everything, and I'm really seeing what's happening here is a lot of folks are trying to do the right thing, but somebody actually, as we're driving down the road toward a cliff, somebody's actually grabbing the steering wheel. And everything that we're discussing here, and remember, I came in late, but I've heard this literally decades. You know, I mean, there's always something, you know, whether it has to do with slavery or something of that nature. There always seems to be a reason that we have to get data, or there's a cost to this, or we got to make sure that the environment, or like the profitability maintains a certain area. In the meantime, people are hurting. And the example I've given numerous times is when you're whipping a naked person and somebody says, okay, we'll stop putting salt on the wounds, but we won't stop whipping. Let's just stop whipping. You know, and every time I hear these things, well, we got to see, you know, because it seems like we're trying to balance economy versus people's health. And I think it should be the other way, because I really believe, if you've noticed, centuries of individuals, we've got along and survived well, not necessarily as we are today with natural gas. We need to evolve and get away from this philosophy that people are expendable. What I think we need to understand is industry is expendable. If it's harming people, you know, Flint, Michigan, what a perfect example. I mean, why did we have to do that? Kill an entire ecosystem for what? And now we're cleaning up for literally decades after this happened. That's what I was trying to say. And I apologize to go on, but just know I want to be a productive member of this group, not a pain in the pants, which I seem to be, but thank you. Let's stop whipping people, okay?
We appreciate, I mean, I do appreciate the input you give. I think it keeps us grounded and trying to remember, you know, that we need to put the community first. There's definitely, you know, that's, I guess, the beauty of the environmental justice conversation that has led to this focus that where inequities are being thought about, you know, this imbalance of power. We heard it very powerfully from during, I think it was our Saturday meeting, in terms of the SEPs. That was very, very enlightening and eye-opening, and really, you know, made internally, now I'm talking internally within the industry, you know, how do we have a better conversation when, you know, we're talking about SEPs and things like that. And so the input is very important. We don't want to think that, supplemental environmental projects, where we heard from a member of a community or an organization that was in the process of applying to get funding for a supplemental environmental project, and the power imbalance was very, very apparent over there. And a part of this conversation we're having today on community-based input into these overall programs is to kind of offset that. I mean, because typically, I know I'm guilty of saying it a lot, is that the community has a lot of challenges when it comes to engaging in research. But then I took a little bit more time and I thought about it, and I started thinking in terms of what Renee had brought up, that community has a lot to offer, whether it's the oral stories or whether it's some of the information that JD is relaying over here. And that has to feature into a lot of the community directed type research. And I use that term community directed because I think that's ultimately where a lot of this should end up. Because the community understands what's going on in their community. And so as research questions are designed and formulated, I think it needs to be done in conjunction with the community. And because they have the local knowledge, they know the questions that they need answered in order to talk about what it is that they're going through. And so I think a part of EJ is, for me, is empowering like the local community so that their voices are heard and the information they need to be able to participate in a lot of these conversations is also being heard. Thanks, Katie. Did you already drop off? Okay. So that's just my response, and it may not like make you feel any better because it's coming from industry, but a lot of us are coming from a genuine place and being genuinely engaged in this conversation. So thank you. And so along those lines, I have had some thoughts around how to help the agency start thinking about this whole idea of community directed research. And I will share those thoughts I'll put them in writing when I have time, but I'll put them in writing and I'll share with them, and we can distribute it among ourselves as we think about maybe putting some kind of recommendation around how we start looking at community research and how we engage the community in the research, into developing the research questions and using their local knowledge as a part of it, and making sure, and for me, this is a personal thing, is making sure that the research team, when they come to the community, are representative of that community. So in a way, we're making sure our researchers are also considering all these DE&I issues to make sure that that their teams have a personal stake in whatever they're doing, and then also employing local communities as a part of the research project. I mean, these are just much bigger recommendations that that may or may not pass, but just kind of sharing some of my thoughts around how a community can be more involved in research projects and make sure there's funding available for the community directed projects to take place. Beatrice looks puzzled. She's like, what the heck? What is Uni talking about now? No, yeah. Any other thoughts from anybody? I just had one last thing I wanted to throw in here. And then after that, I think I'm going to be done. And so unless anybody else have anything to begin in.
No, I just wanted to add to JD's comment, which thank you. I really appreciate it. And I think you're absolutely right. But the other thing that I'm always thinking about, like, money doesn't necessarily drive me, but I feel like there always has to be all these arguments for us to be validated, and our stories and our lived experience to be validated. And that's why I'm always coming back to the economics, because that moves so many people, which is very unfortunate, but that's just how society works. And we're not going to change it in this one task force. And it's bad business. Environmental justice is bad business. Environmental injustice, climate injustice is bad business, right? It's bad for human health. It's bad for our environment. It's bad for our overall well-being as a society. So if we think about it, even if our only motivation is business and economics, it's bad for business. And I just want to make sure that we prove that, right? Because when we just say it's bad for people, that doesn't get us as far as it should, because our values are placed in the wrong place as a society, right? Money talks, business talks, and that's very unfortunate. And I'm hoping, in 7 generations or sooner, that can shift and we can shift that paradigm. That probably won't happen, in the next year or two. So how do we make the case that environmental justice and climate justice and clean air and clean water and healthy communities are good for business? People that are healthy are good for business. It's good for all of us if we are healthy and we can breathe our air and we can thrive as a society, and we can all come to the table and offer all our talents and all our skills and the beauty that is humankind. And again, that is good for all of us at the end of the day. So anyway, I just wanted to add where I'm coming from, that when we have a society that is healthy, a democracy that is strong, at the end of the day, that is good for business and we all win.
I don't know how anybody can say anything after that, Beatrice, but I think it was very well said. I mean, I think a lot of industry, I belong to a couple coalitions, are having that very conversation, um, and and just kind of watch the space, I guess. And it's sad that it took, I guess, this long for society as a whole to recognize that specific um, sense or way of looking at it. But I can say Colorado is way ahead of that with the recent mission change regulation is turning the focus back on health and companies recognizing that these communities where we get our workers from. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to add something on? I just wanted to, one last thing to capture for Morgan to capture in her notes is something that I'd been thinking was a tiered approach to data, because somebody talked about the purple data and all these different data sets. Some data, even though it's not QA/QC, like to the nth degree for a regulatory process, can at least drive an agency to take a closer look at a region. So having that data available and clearly articulating it that it hasn't gone through like the regulatory QA/QC process, but it can be utilized as a way of screening concerns. And so that data, along with the data that's connected to some kind of, we were talking about a hotline or a system where people can report concerns to, when all that data starts to align, and then it can lead to a different kind of decision. And so I think one of the things that we may be charged with or considering is what kind of decision tools can we help the agency develop in terms of how does this data fit into your overall decision-making process, or these kinds of data fit into your overall decision-making process. So I think I am talked out, is there anything else anybody wants to add on? I mean, I think we've given I think we've made a lot of progress from the recurring questions. I think, we can look at them a little bit differently and potentially find ways to incorporate them into our recommendations.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Joel.
Oh, maybe we have the same question. We really, as your staff, appreciate all the specificity and ideas around kind of specific topics, recommendations, and follow-ups. And we're taking good notes. Beatriz, I want to make sure I'm understanding kind of the connection between what you were saying and the potential recommendations of the task force. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so that's why I kind of wanted to come back to you on it, if that's okay. I think what we're hearing you say is that agency decisions should consider the full suite of economic impacts of a decision, which would include not only economic benefits of a decision, for example, if permitting a new facility could create jobs, for example, but also adverse economic impacts, so things like economic losses associated with health impacts or just any type of economic loss, right? We often talk about things like the social cost of climate, for example, with greenhouse gas rulemaking. So is that what you are getting at in terms of like a recommendation you want the task force to consider, or am I like putting words in your mouth and that's not what you were saying?
I guess it is, but I don't want to like it to be framed like it's that same narrative that we've always used, that it's just for, I feel like the negative impacts are overlooked, or that piece of the data is not considered. For example, I don't know, like not capturing methane gas and just letting it out into the atmosphere, and why we have this benefit of potential like economic opportunities for certain communities, right? what is the cost of adding methane to, our atmosphere, and in these same disproportionately impacted communities are the most vulnerable to climate change, right? So then if we look at the economics, it's like, it doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't want to have those communities so vulnerable to climate change that 10 years down the road, actually they're more at risk than whatever temporary, economic gain they had. So it needs to be more transparent that, again, climate injustice, pollution is bad for our economy. It really is. It's a really poor choice. Because how much does it cost? And maybe this is like too complicated, but how much does it cost? How much does a wildfire cost to the community, right? How much and why are those exacerbated? It's because of climate change, right? And it's costing my community a lot to be able to be confronting wildfires that, methane gas from oil and gas industry has made it it's made it worse, and it's making it worse. So, and again, so many people are driven by the economics, that if they don't have a strong society and a community that, is resilient, their business model isn't good, because they're harming the environment and they're harming people. Am I saying the same thing, Joel? But I feel like this economic factor has always been driven in favor of industry. So I think we need to change that paradigm as well and really show the true cost. So industry can be innovative, can, whatever it takes, if they want to exist, do no harm. Do no harm to people, do no harm to the environment, do no harm to our climate, do no harm to other species, do no harm to water. If you will exist, you will do no harm. And how do we tie that to economics and the social cost? So I don't know if I'm saying the same thing, Joel, but I just want to make sure that that we're not perpetuating the narrative of just economic growth, but the true economic cost.
Thanks, Beatriz. I think that additional context was helpful for us as your staff. Like we do with all the recommendations. We just want to understand what you're getting at so that we accurately reflect it. And I thought there was more to it than just consider the social cost of carbon or something, for example. So it's just helpful for us to like really get a full picture of what you're thinking about. So thank you for fleshing it out.
I just want to add that, it would be great if we could do no harm all the time and every moment to living, to, the biosphere. But I feel that these decisions are not made, they're made autocratically. And that these decisions need to be made in a democratic fashion. That is my beef with this.
I was waiting for some more. You were getting really interesting over there. So, I work for the regulator.
Let's go back to Flint. All of that was in the cover of night, everything. The city manager making these decisions, and what happened between the governor and the city manager, and understanding that DuPont sort of made the river. It's, I guess, that they could just throw all of their waste in the river. All of this was under, was not exposed. And then finally it was, after, certain whistleblowers risked their lives. Nothing about the Flint chapter was democratic. And that's what needs to shift.
No, I agree with that. Just to kind of, I agree with that. I think looking at back to what Beatrice was talking about, I think what you're talking about is accountability, and also like how do you hold companies accountable when they make decisions that are bad for business, for their own business, you know? And so unfortunately, a lot of that is individual company decisions, and it's kind of difficult to regulate that, or for us to make recommendations for companies to like capture methane, you know what I mean? But that's ultimately where it went, because I think a lot of it was various regulatory pressures, you know, kind of drove that conversation, and also, and potentially internal discussions as well. And so from the regulated community, and I can say this much, around environmental justice, we've been having a lot of conversations about how we look at it, you know, how we talk about it, and how we respond to EJ concerns. And I mean, that sounds really industry speak, and I apologize for that, but I think in the near future, you may see how that gets implemented. And so I think that's the most I can say. In a few weeks, I may have more information that I can speak to, you know, how we're looking at EJ from a regulated community perspective. Okay, I think, you know, I'm grateful for everybody sharing their personal opinions, or giving that kind of information that, you know, that I can take back with me to have conversations with my people, and I appreciate it. I will continue to try and be as transparent as I can from the industry perspective, but also remember, I'm here especially as a toxicologist and, you know, a public health person. And so I want to, you know, keep that role going forward, and not let, you know, other things kind of get in the way, or lead the good work that we're doing, you know, off track. And so I just appreciate that. Unless there's anything else that somebody wants to bring in, I think Labna, looks like you're about to say something, or.
Yeah, I know that we had, like, you know, we focused a lot of our conversation around like community science and community narratives, and I wasn't sure, Uni, if you wanted to talk specifically about like the social determinants of health. I know we.
Oh wait.
I think she accidentally unmuted. But yeah, I wasn't sure if we wanted to have like a conversation specifically about the social determinants, or if we feel like we've kind of covered that, and if not, you know, that's something that we want to push to a future meeting.
Yeah, I think we can push it to a future meeting, because one of the things I wanted to bring up was the Department of Health and Human Services and their recent plan, where they have a really where they talk about how they're going to address environmental justice. And we can look at that and see if some of those social determinants in there, or social indicators, are things that we could consider, and what the data around those would look like. And that's why I threw that in there. And so I can share, I don't have it right now, but if we can find the link to the environmental justice strategy that Department of Health and Human Services put out. It's a little bit different from the one that the EPA put out. And I thought this was more, this is more in my line of work. And so I wanted us just to look at some of their indicators and the definitions of health disparities and things like that, and make sure that if we have access to that data, that would be helpful. If we don't, then we can start thinking about how we start collecting that kind of data. Okay, I see JD's got his hand up. Go ahead, JD. You can wrap it up for us.
Because we're doing this, I want everybody to be aware, and this is something I'm speaking so you can do some maybe positive, but with Xcel Energy, for the PUC allowing Xcel Energy to capitalize off of the backs of the poor. That's what I've been hearing, the impoverished, so they can recoup their loss from the Texas thing. This is one thing that's going to hurt everybody because the Public Utilities Commission actually authorized that. And the last I heard, even in the paper, even the governor denounced it. These are things that I was trying to bring up that actually, when I included some of those things, and I really believe these need to be addressed publicly because this group, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, I shouldn't say this group, there has to be trust. And every time something like this comes up, throw us away. No mentido. I mean, it's gone. And I just got off a Zoom meeting, that's why I was late, where they were talking about how the government cannot be trusted. So this is another thing that I really think needs to be addressed, whether it's in this group or, but I think it has to be the entire department. And I say that respectfully because I do want this to succeed. And thank you for allowing me to speak in this. I truly, truly appreciate it. I should say participate. I like that word better. Thanks.
Participate. There you go. Unless there's anything else, can we wrap this up, Lubna? We can talk about what the next, when we need to meet next later, right?
Yeah, for sure. And Uni, if you want a motion to adjourn, you can do that, and Beatrice and Sheila can participate. And then Uni, if you have a moment, maybe we can stay on and just connect for a couple minutes to talk about next steps.
Okay. Okay. I motion that we adjourn this meeting.
I second.
Yay. Okay, everybody have like a super week, you know. We'll catch up soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Uni. Awesome. And I'm gonna hit stop record.